Today's part of Green Campus Day, which most of you will be aware is when campuses across Australia and New Zealand fling their doors open to their green buildings, infrastructure, systems and programs. And it was just so inspiring this morning to see the lineup of what's happening around Australia and New Zealand today as part of that. Really great to see it's grown over the last few years. So today, of course, we're here to talk about electric vehicles, and this is a not just new and sort of emerging area, but an incredibly exciting area. It's sort of a subset of the transition to renewable energy, but unlike renewables, where they've sort of, we've seen solar PVs on the roof, for decades now, and yet we're still waiting for them to become mainstream and exciting, whatever. It's extraordinary to witness the speed at which electric vehicles are really taking hold. And that's just in Australia. That's not even thinking about what's happening overseas, because, like so much of the renewables transition, we are a bit lagging behind. So it's just going to be so exciting to hear from Jonathan, who today is just eminently qualified to talk to us on this particular topic. Jonathan is the Green Infrastructure Project Manager here at UTS, and in that capacity he's been very involved in tying together some of the projects around major solar, PV solar, doing a lot of the cost benefit analysis, but also some of the behind the scenes sort of packaging it up, working with corporate partners, not just our own solar roofs, but also regional and rural solar farms with direct purchasing agreements, and also some really innovative stuff with UTS putting solar onto rooftops of rented buildings. In addition to renewable energy, he's been very involved in working with some large water infrastructure projects as well. He's very involved in renewables in his local community in terms of working with community solar, and I believe has spent the last 2 days actually at the Business Renewables Centre Australia boot camp. And he is an absolutely avid electric vehicle owner and driver himself. So I hand over to you, Jonathan, to take us off.
Yeah, Seb asked for a bio, but I thought I much prefer hear what Seb thinks of me and what I do. And that was great. So as you may get the impression, this presentation is somewhat professional, somewhat personal through my own experience owning EVs. So I'll just get the screen sharing going. All right, so get your electric wheels on by myself. In terms of this presentation, quick background of my work with Danielle, Seb and the sustainability team and property department at UTS. My EV purchasing so far, some slides on an EV road trip I did when we first got our first Tesla, EVs at UTS and EV take up in Australia. So it's fast paced, lots of slides, but I'm happy for it to be interactive so long as we can get through the slides. So I was brought on initially 11 years ago at UTS, 2 days per week for 5 months, and I'm still here. And that was originally to bring on the Trigeneration project, which had been through initial feasibility stage to bring it through detailed feasibility and delivery. At the time, it was going to reduce UTS emissions by 30–40% by using efficient gas-fired generation to provide electricity, heating and cooling to the UTS campus. However, due to rising gas prices, because Australia started exporting gas and the price would go up to global markets, we actually canned that project. So I started with a failure at UTS. Not that it was my fault so much. But then since then, we've done lots of fun and interesting stuff. We did Australia's first Offsite Solar corporate PPA. And as Seb mentioned, I've just spent a day and a half helping other corporates learn how to do offsite solar at the BRCA Corporate PPA Bootcamp. We also have a chilled water link from the Central Park Central Thermal Plant into the UTS Thermal Plant. So our central plant provides chilling and heating from one plant to 8 UTS buildings, but we were running out of space to keep up with demand, mainly cooling tower space on building 1 to meet UTS Central and all the new buildings. So we entered into a 15-year deal to buy 4.5 megawatts of cooling from Central Park, who had built their own central plant. And that provides around 2/3 of our cooling capacity now across the year, and a very innovative project, first in Australia. Lots of rooftop solar. These are the best looking ones at Haberfield and Building 6, the student housing. And I will speak about the Lord Street Solar project later. So in terms of my EV purchasing so far, it seems a bit crazy, but I've bought 3 EVs in the last 3 years. First, Tesla Model 3 went on sale May 31st in 2019, and we decided to purchase one the 1st of June, on day 2. And that arrived 3 months later, and we owned it for 2 years. Cost around $67,000 or $70,500 on road. And 2 years later, we sold it for $57,000 because we had bought a second one to replace it. So that was $59,500 plus the $1,500 cost of white seats. So I thought I'd present the raw price. At the time, I just noticed that rebates had started, so $3,000 EV rebate and $2,700 stamp duty rebate. Tesla's prices were at their lowest we'd ever seen, and you could get them quite quickly. So I thought, what a great time to update. It came with new battery chemistry, which increased the range from 330 kilometers or so back up to 400 kilometers. So we got a better car for about the same price. The old one needed new tires anyway, so that would have cost an extra $2,000. So I just thought a great time to change. We actually always wanted a Model Y. So they went on sale June 10th at 10:08 a.m. and we ordered it at 10:13 a.m. and ended up getting the one of the first delivered in Australia. So that means we've suddenly gone from a 1-car family to a 2-car family. We've always been 1 car. Not sure what to do. 2 kids, it's getting more necessary to have 2 cars. But in the meantime, we are hiring out our Model 3 on a peer-to-peer car sharing network. And I've hired it out 3 times now. And that might cover a lot of our lease costs. So we might keep it around for a little while longer. So here was our Tesla Model 3, our first one, on holiday up near Foster with a roof racks and paddleboard on top. So it was our functional family car for a family of 4. It wasn't some, just environmental initiative or because it really looks really nice. And here's me getting the Tesla Model Y. And that's on Tesla's Instagram for the first delivery in Australia. We got it at 10 a.m. in Miranda on the day, and I think that other people got it at the same time in Alexandria and Miranda at the same time as well. So why on earth are we buying these EVs? We sort of 3 key objectives: to support an early stage industry. EV companies are quite new. They need customers to help grow. So supporting that new industry. Also, we felt people are very interested in EVs, but they're unfamiliar, feels risky. If we get one and use it as a family, our neighbors, family and friends see them and they become more familiar and mainstream. And we've really seen that in my partner, her family of, so 4 families in total, including us. She's got a sister, a brother and her parents. It was 7 cars, 8 cars between them, but now 6 of those are either Teslas or they've ordered a Tesla. So her sister, her brother, her dad, her mum, only 2 left that are petrol cars. So just in that sort of sample, you can see how us getting it early helped them see that it's a practical car and a good car to own, and encourages others to get EVs. And I'm sure many of you will see more and more Teslas and electric vehicles on the road if you've got an eye for them. So next on to an EV road trip, just to show that it is practical to drive one out into the regions. So we went from Sydney to Melbourne in September 2019. We'd just bought the Tesla, so it was kind of a rite of passage that I got to take it on this big drive. So that's what we did. We drove it from our house to my parents' house in Melbourne to go and visit them for a weekend. Here's us leaving and me supercharging and Olivia asleep with our bunnies. When you put it into the navigator, it measures how much capacity you will have when you arrive at your next charging stop. So you can see we're charged to 100% and we would arrive on 30%. And the fact that it maps it out and tracks it along the way, you can see this was the grey initial estimate and then the revised as you go. So it gives you great confidence that you're not just going to suddenly run out of battery or something like that. There's us supercharging. I think that's the Goulburn charger there. And when you plug it in and say we want to go here, you don't have to work out where the superchargers are. It actually maps it all out. It says from Melbourne, we'll go to Euroa, charge there for 20 minutes, Wodonga 25 minutes, Gundagai 25 minutes. So it's all quite manageable and simple. I will note that in our new Tesla, we can skip charges because it's got more range. These are like 200 to 250 kilometers between charging spots. We can actually skip straight to Wodonga and maybe straight to Goulburn as well. So it's nice having that extra flexibility, particularly if the kids have fallen asleep and you want to enjoy the peace and go to the next charger rather than stop and wake them up. It tracks how fast you're charging. At this stage, it was 82 kilowatts, so it's adding 600 kilometers in an hour. And you can see it charges much quicker when it's at the lower range, when the battery's more empty, 0 to 20%. The final 20% takes longer, maybe half an hour at the superchargers. How do I go to the next slide? More supercharging. Olivia enjoying playing in the car while we supercharge for 15 minutes. There's the Roa supercharger. Here's how much we get charged for that. So I think I say at the end it was $50 to get to Melbourne and back. There's me plugging in at Sailboard headquarters down in Sandringham in Melbourne to get a bit more charge. It turned out there's an electrical issue at my parents' house, so we couldn't charge there. My dad's done too many hack wiring jobs to his own house over the years and not a qualified electrician, so we couldn't charge there. So we ended up negotiating a couple of bottles of wine to charge from the next door neighbours over the fence. So you could charge at home quite slowly. You could charge at superchargers. There's also commercial chargers. So this is what my dad normally drives. No, he doesn't, but that's what's down at Sailboard headquarters, that he maintains that tractor for them. But it was nice to get an old guy practice driving an electric vehicle while we were down there. More charging on the way back. You occasionally see other chargers. I have seen them quite full before, but I've never had to wait to get a charge in Goulburn or Heatherbray or anywhere like that. Those other chargers were for Tesla, provided by Tesla and for Tesla only. In Europe, Tesla are opening them up to other cars, but in Australia, it's still Tesla only. So if you don't have a Tesla, you go to other chargers like ChargeFox Network or EVIE network. And it's probably, they're not quite as many chargers at each spot as Tesla, but they are dotted around the country and growing over time. This one had a little solar system next to it in Barnawartha North, just near Wodonga. So UTS was an early mover in EV charging. So over to UTS and EV charging. When Building 11 was constructed, we put a microgrid on the roof, and part of that was electric vehicle charging downstairs, and it was a PowerPoint. That might seem quite basic, but if you're coming to UTS and charging every day, you probably haven't driven from Goulburn or Newcastle, probably only 20 or 50 Ks, so you don't need too much, and you're going to stay for 8 hours. So a PowerPoint is perfectly fine. There are two other levels of chargers, AC charging, which can go from 7 to 22 kilowatts, which takes 3 to 10 hours from 0 to 100. To buy one of those chargers costs $3,000, and to install one costs $3,000. But these DC fast chargers are very expensive. They're very fast, from 50 to 350 kilowatts. They're more that if you're driving on the highway and you've driven 300 kilometers, and you want to go an extra 200 Ks, then you need the DC fast charging. So in terms of what we're doing at UTS, we're more concentrating on AC charging because people are here for a longer time. And in terms of spending money, if this is perfectly adequate, we should spend our sustainability budget on other things that rather than unnecessary things. So we have a AC charger in building 10. It actually took quite a while to fit the spot. We could have to find the right spot. At first, we were thinking a hero location where it's like the best park in the building. But then we thought through the risk that what if we pick the best spot and then no EVs come for 3 years and everyone's driving past it going, why is there an empty EV spot there every day? Secondly, we thought, well, let's go the opposite. Let's put it at the bottom of building 11, the very final spot. So it'll be kept free for EVs if they arrive. We ended up using a contractor parking, which is the car park managers, they manage it. And if you ring ahead, you can go and park there and get a charge. My car's actually down there getting a charge today. In building 6, we're working on getting 10 EV charging spots, probably mark a couple of them with that nice EV green charging. And as more electric cars come and more staff use them, we'll make them more dedicated EV charging spots. One benefit we're wondering about is UTS is in a global market of attracting the best staff and academics. And if we have some great professor or similar who becomes quite reliant on charging their car at UTS, maybe they live in an apartment or a terrace house and can't have home charging, it might help in staff retention and these sorts of benefits if we provide these sorts of facilities to our staff. So that's a sort of another benefit we're looking at for promoting EV charging. Couldn't quite get the greatest picture, but UTS has developed a 1 megawatt solar project out at Botany. So UTS Tech Lab is in this bottom left corner here, if you can see that, block B and C. But we've worked with Dexus to get a 25-year agreement where they let us install solar panels on their rooftops of their business park. We're only a tenant at 2 buildings. We have taken up a tenancy in building D. We ran into trouble with building E where Osgood weren't willing to provide us a meter to install a solar system on building E. So now we're installing a bank of EV chargers in this spot here to get a meter, so then we can reapply and get our solar installed there. So we have EV charging under development at UTS. This particular project was in the media a month ago, in Eco-Generation, PV Magazine, and so on, about unlocking a new model where we get more solar on the warehouses of the places of Sydney and Melbourne, so near where all the electricity demand is, because I think a lot of us have flown in to Melbourne or Sydney airports and going, look at all those warehouse rooftops, why aren't they covered in solar panels? So this is an innovative new model of using urban warehouse rooftops to be urban solar farms, and UTS is leading the way on that. Seb, if you have that link handy, you might want to chuck it in the chat on one of those articles. One consideration though for EV charging at UTS is at building in 10 and 11, imagine this future state where everyone drives an electric car and there's 300 spots and there's 300 chargers and it's 8:30 a.m. and everyone plugs in at the same time. That would be 6,600 kilowatts of demand. The current demand for building 10 is more like 800 kilowatts. So that would be an 825% increase in the demand. So it's purely hypothetical, just to show that charging EVs is not a small deal. It will add about 15 or 25% of demand to the Australian energy system. And there's a huge opportunity to manage that in a smart way where we charge at the best times. So building 6, those 10 chargers will include demand management, which gets them to all work beneath, say, 100 kilowatt limit and charge at reduced rates, or when demand is low or when the energy price is low, or even when wind and solar is really high, we'll ramp up demand during that time and ramp it down at other times. Because if people all charge at 8:30, they'll all have full batteries again by 9:30. So we can spread that out over the day because people might be here from 9 till 5 and so on. So UTS EV Charging-Summary in terms of our strategy. One problem is getting ICEd. So ICE stands for internal combustion engine. So it's a petrol car. So we're a bit hesitant about putting in EV chargers and petrol cars parked there each day. So we're coordinating it with Interpark and locate it in a flexible location and considering a booking system for the future. Another issue is if we install it and no one uses it. So we're adding EV chargers incrementally. So the more emails Seb and Danielle or I get saying, oh, I drove in today, I need a charge, the more EVs we install. We don't want to install hundreds of them and just sit there not being used for the next 5 years. So the cost of using them is the cost of the electricity. We're interested in whether users should pay for that electricity in the future, or maybe it's a staff benefit, and we're watching that. And in terms of how many do we need, so our strategy was to get started and be ready, which we are, and monitor demand remotely. So we were using Everty to monitor that, but stopped that during COVID. But as demand ramps up, we probably use some sort of monitoring platform for that as well. So nearing the end of the presentation, what's the more Australian and global view? So EVs are certainly catching on in Australia. This is a graph on a website that is dedicated to electric vehicles in Australia called The Driven. And they have this live, reasonably live, it says June 22. You can see the cumulative total is really growing. Annual sales goes down a bit because this is year to date in 2022. By the end of the year, that will be quite a bit higher. But we're around 20,000 vehicles last year out of 1 million vehicles, so around 2%. But in August, Tesla had a record month, and the Model 3 became the 4th highest selling car in Australia for August. So behind the Toyota Hilux and Ford Ranger and RAV4, but a boom month, and I think September will also be high. I don't think we're really having an EV boom in Australia yet. Maybe that's next year or the year after. We're certainly having a Tesla boom. They are really dominating the Australian EV market with maybe 80% of the sales. Whereas in Europe, they have a lot more range of EV electric vehicles to buy from Nissan and Peugeot and Volkswagen and so on, ones that aren't available in Australia, or if they are very low supply. But Sweden last year were up to 20% of new car sales were battery electric vehicles. The Netherlands was 19.9%. The United Kingdom, 11%. So we were 2% last year. A lot of those countries, 15, 20% in Europe. So it's really catching on in Europe due to high petrol prices and more sort of incentives to buy in EVs, like going in. We do have a lot of them here. So we got rebates here. We get to go into the T2 lanes. What are they called? The commuter lanes, not the bus lanes. I think in Norway, they get free rego. You get that in the ACT. So a few initiatives here, but they've really caught on in Europe. I think that was the last slide. So over to the questions.
Wow, that was fantastic, Jonathan. Really great. So many different elements to explore. We definitely have a few questions in the chat. So I might kick off with the first one from Eleanor, who says, clearly you're a Tesla fan and you've converted the rest of your family. But what do you think about some of the other brands? And I'm going to add actually to that and ask you something that you may or may not know about. I've read that some brands such as Tesla are designed from the ground up to be an electric car. And then at the other end of the spectrum, other electric vehicles around were designed as a combustion engine petrol vehicle that have just had an electric engine popped in it. and that they're not as good as the ones that are designed to be an electric vehicle from the very beginning. So I suppose, blending Eleanor's question there with my follow-up, are they all as good as each other, or are some better other than Tesla?
Yeah, I am a Tesla fan, but I desperately would like to get a non-Tesla electric car. But every time I look at it, the other brands don't quite compete at this stage. A good example of what you're talking about, Seb, is Hyundai. So they had the Kona and the first Ioniq, and they were clearly petrol cars, in conception, but made as electric vehicles. Whereas Hyundai now have the Ioniq 5, which is an EV built from the ground up. So really taking up all the advantages of not having to have as much space in the front for an engine and all the different geometries that EVs allow. So the reason we have Teslas is because of our first experience, which was just seamless. We had to get it serviced once, and that was $200 to change the cabin filter and the wipers. So $200 in 2 years was the only servicing, no other troubles at all. The charging network is fantastic. Personally, I'd like to try like the Polestar car, which is a EV dedicated brand, or the Volvo XC40. But my partner Lauren says, what's wrong with our Teslas? They've been so good. It feels risky to try anything else, but desperately want to see more choice and more options coming to the Australian market.
Great. And then we've got a question from Asif on charger types.
Yep.
So for those of us that are not EV owners yet, can you just walk us through a little bit more about the different types of chargers? You mentioned that Tesla's got some dedicated ones, but that in other parts of the world, you can plug other cars into them, fast and slow. And so just how many different types of chargers are there, and how compatible are they all?
Yeah, so there's 3 levels of charging. Level 1 is charging at home from a power point, and you can get up to 15 amps, and that's more than enough for most people, so you don't need anything. Level 2 is that AC charging, like what we have at Building 10 and what we're planning at Building 6 and in Botany at the Tech Lab. And rather than 16 amps, that's more like 32. So you can charge it from 0 to 100% in about 10 hours or something like that, maybe even 7 hours. And people get those at home. They're like $800 for a Tesla one at home, plus $500 to install it. And for those more commercial ones, more like $2,000 to $3,000 plus installation. But then there's the very fast charging, level 3, and they're 50 to 350 kilowatts and can cost from $100,000 to $500,000 to install. They're big pieces of electrical infrastructure. They have to convert that AC power to DC power, and it goes direct DC into your battery because your battery is DC. It doesn't rely on the onboard converter to take AC power and convert it into DC. So level 1 at home, level 2 more commercial AC charging, and then level 3 is fast DC charging for highway top-up range extending for longer trips.
So a follow-on question then from maybe some of the building managers that we've got with us. So in the work that you've been doing at UTS, have you yet had to do any alterations or augmentations to existing buildings as you put these charging stations into our spaces, or are you finding that most existing commercial spaces can accommodate these chargers?
Building 10 was only 1 or 2 chargers, so that was no augmentation, or apart from getting the wire from the switchboard to the site. So it was about $3,000 installation. Building 6, we haven't worked through that yet, but as a general principle, I think electric vehicle charging should soak up spare capacity and not require us to add new capacity, because it's quite discretionary. Cars are parked 90, 95% of the time, why should we build new electrical infrastructure when by smoothing out when they charge or using smart charging, we can just soak up spare capacity? So for building 6, we'll find the most cost-effective supply capacity. It might be 30 kilowatts or 100 kilowatts, and we'll limit that group of chargers to that maximum amount, and they can share that capacity. So if 3 cars are plugged in, they can charge at max rates. But if all 10 are plugged in, they'll have to share 50% rate or something like that.
Great. And we've got a few more questions on chargers as well as some earlier ones not on chargers. So let's just, before we move on, we'll stay with chargers for a minute. We've got a question here from Jason asking, what about bi-directional charging where the EVs can begin exporting power?
Yep. So it's a very interesting development that your electric car can kind of back up your house or provide energy into the grid when needed. An electric car has about a 60 kilowatt hour battery, and most homes use around 10 kilowatt hours a day. So, some are 20, some are 10. But that could back up your house for 6 days, for instance. I'm a little skeptical of it though. I think EVs are a great benefit to the grid by soaking up spare capacity and using power when it's cheap and abundant from wind and solar, and that benefits the grid. So when we're balancing supply and demand in the grid, it's not just about generating at the right times, but using power at the right times. And I think we'll get like 70 or 80% of the benefit of EVs just by charging them at the right times. If you were to install bi-directional, so that let's firstly talk through one directional when you're charging the car normally. You go from your switchboard to a wall charger and then into the car AC power, and then it converts it on board to DC to go into the battery. If you do bi-directional, you have to have an onboard inverter to convert DC from the battery into AC. Then your wall charger has to be bi-directional, that it can both charge the car and receive AC power. Has to go back to your switchboard at your home. Then you have to put in grid protection that if there's an outage in the grid because they're doing line work, that it won't start, your car won't supplying into the grid and electrocute the linesman while it's meant to have been isolated. So where a one-directional charger is $800 plus $500 to install, once you think through all those additional costs for bi-directional, it might be $10,000 rather than $1,300. So it's got some cost issues, and it's not fully tested whether we really need it yet. Just by charging at the right times might be just as beneficial. I think that will happen a bit. Bi-directional charging, will it be an academic experiment or become a mainstay of our electricity grid and keeping the grid balanced? I'm less convinced at this stage.
All right, and just a final one on charging before we move on from that. So just to clarify, Asif is asking about the compatibility. I mean, you talked about the 3 different types or levels of charging, but amongst the different brands of cars, say, for example, that bottom level that you were talking about, your home charging, you can pretty much charge, the car itself comes with its own cord and you can just plug it into normal plug in the wall.
Correct.
All brands into all. And is that the same basically for the 2 faster levels of charging as well? The car's own cord can pretty much be plugged into either of those other 2 or not?
Yeah, so wouldn't it be great if they all just had the same plugs and they were all compatible? That's what we all want, right? But there's that tendency of the Apple changing USB to Lightning to whatever it's called now, USB-C and so on, to get a new phone, and you got to buy a whole new set of plugs. And that's what it was like early on, but standardization has come about. So on level 2 chargers, they're generally all the same. There are some legacy cars like Nissan Leafs that require a different plug, and you can get an adapter for that. But generally they're all the same. Level 2 charging is all the same. Similarly with fast charging, they are standardizing and generally using the same. When we did the Building 10 charger 3 years ago, we had this risk that will there be standard cables? So what we've got there is the wall box, but people have to bring their own cord so they can plug it in. I think in the future, it'd be good to see those commercial chargers, level 2 chargers, have the cord so you just hop out of the car, pull it out and plug it in, rather than having to get a separate cable out of your boot and charge both ends in, and it's a bit less convenient.
Great, thanks for that. And Suzanne asks about safety, both, I suppose, of the charging units, but also the batteries. I mean, in the early days, we all heard scary stories about lithium batteries catching on fire, etc. So in terms of where the industry and the technology is at now, are there any safety issues specifically around fire for both charging infrastructure and batteries?
Yeah, I think part of that discussion on lithium-ion batteries and fires is that they're a very different type of fire from like a petrol fire, in that they kind of gain momentum and they're harder to stop, because as one battery catches on fire, it overheats the one next to it. They're all a bunch of little cells in their packs. So it's different for firefighters and a different type of risk. GPT have done, they own a lot of commercial buildings like UTS's buildings and shopping centres and so on. And they did some research into this for both lithium-ion batteries for their buildings and EVs, funded partly by City of Sydney. And I was involved in that research project to an extent. And that they remarked that 1 in a million cars parking at their shopping centres catch on fire. So about 4 a year for them, being petrol cars. And so there's already a risk that they have to manage. Whereas EVs catch on fire, it's a factor of like 5 times less. So the likelihood is less, that it'll happen less often than a petrol car, but the risk and the outcome is that it requires a different type of firefighting and so on. So generally a low risk, but they catch on fire and need different firefighting to put them out.
Great, thanks for that. All right, well, we've pretty much exhausted all the current questions in the chat. If you've got any that we haven't covered, by all means, feel free to drop them in. Or if you would rather just come off mute and ask a question verbally, put your hand up and we can do it that way as well. And so I have got a question, and that is, you've touched twice, I think, Jonathan, on the role and the potential for EV charging infrastructure to potentially play in the broader energy management of big organizations like universities. Thinking about where the industry is likely to go over the next 5 years, both in terms of the technologies that are available to us, but also the price of energy, etc. And I suppose, the fact that we're all now struggling to reduce our carbon footprint at the same time, as well as reduce our energy bills. So where do you think, thinking, over the next 5 years and investing in this infrastructure on campuses, how do you think EV infrastructure is going to help us in our managing of energy?
Yeah, I think there's two sides of that. One is the how the energy industry is looking at that, and the other is UTS and its emissions. So at the energy level, the example we're looking at is air conditioning. So Australia went from less than 1 million air conditioners in homes 10, 15 years ago to almost every home having an air conditioner. And we had to spend $45 billion to upgrade the networks to handle that increase in demand of air conditioners. And the energy industry is looking at EVs and saying, let's not make that same mistake again. So there's a lot of trials around smart EV charging, sending incentives to households and others to charge at the right time, and also to have remote switch off during grid events where there's an outage of a power station or something like that. In the UK, they're making it mandatory that home chargers have a delay of like 5 minutes or 1 hour, that you plug it in, but it doesn't charge immediately, just so lots of people don't start charging at the right time, because that can mean that there's a lot of generation suddenly needed because a lot of people start charging at the same time. And in the UK, they're very conscious of this issue because the grid managers have an issue called TV pickup. And that's when the credits of EastEnders come on a Sunday night at 7:30. That some crazy number like 20 million cups of tea are made in a minute. And the grid manager has to be ready to call upon generation to switch on to meet that kettle demand of 10 million or 20 million cups of tea after EastEnders. So they're very conscious of these, how tricky it is to balance the grid. And they're worried that people will come home and plug in at the same time and cause peak demand. So it's still in trial phase in Australia. I hope it turns into more solid action to really take advantage of EVs, that they charging them is quite discretionary. We could do it when we get home or in the middle of the night or in the middle of the day, and trying to send the right incentives or protocols to make that work well. At a UTS level, we have scope 1 emissions, like our petrol car fleet and using gas for heating and hot water, scope 2 emissions using electricity, and then scope 3 emissions, which is our suppliers, maybe staff travel, staff commutes, and this sort of thing. So if we start charging cars at UTS, that'll increase our scope 2 emissions, because we that electricity will go on our carbon accounting and we'll be responsible for that. But we can manage that by increasing our renewable energy developments, which we're doing to get to higher percentages of renewables. In turn, that would reduce our scope 3 emissions because our staff and students are causing less emissions by getting to and from UTS. So long as they're not switching from a train to driving an EV into town. We don't want to encourage that. Does that answer the question, Seb?
Absolutely, I think so. Yeah, really great. So another one from me, and that is, putting aside, of course, the very real issue of the resources and everything else that goes into manufacturing these new technologies. But if we're going to get to a point where EVs are genuinely significantly more sustainable than conventional fossil fueled cars, we really need to be charging them using renewable energy. And of course, the reality at the moment is, for most people, when we plug them into the power point, whether it's a fast or a slow charger, a sizable chunk of that is still coming from fossil fuel. I know you're someone who's got PV on the roof of your house. Can you talk us a little bit through that interface of having solar cells on your own roof and potentially a car that can be charged using from solar energy? Do you make an attempt to try to charge up as much as possible on the weekend when the sun's shining, when you're home and not using the car, or not? Or, what numbers have you done? How much is it costing you or saving you? That sort of stuff.
Yeah. Well, to think of that first EV we bought, that we paid 66,000 for it and sold it for 57. So over 2 years, it cost us $3 plus $9,000. And I think the numbers would be even better on our second one, because we could sell it probably for more now today than we paid for it. The cost of ownership is very low. I think petrol savings probably $2,000 to $3,000 a year. It costs us maybe a fifth to charge it via electricity, and the majority of our charging is from our own solar panels. I also charge in the middle of the day when solar is very abundant in New South Wales, and the price sometimes goes negative in the wholesale market because there's too much energy available. So no, I haven't done exact numbers on all that, sorry to say. My friend Jay is a software engineer, and he set up a startup called Charge HQ, and his app controls my charging to match our solar exports. So if we want to on a certain day, we can just dedicate our car to being charged from our own solar. So there's clever software like that becoming available. But you strike on an interesting point on how to be renewable, both at home or as UTS or charging a car, the original way was green power, that you buy certificates from wind and solar farms at the same volume as you use energy annually. The new method is power purchase agreements, where you either invest in wind and solar or you sign contracts with new wind and solar. So your energy purchasing directly helps financing new wind and solar that will reduce emissions of the New South Wales grid. This third sort of step is now to say, well, if UTS buys enough solar and wind to cover itself across the year, so if we're 45,000 megawatt hours per annum and we bought that much new wind and solar and supported projects that generate that much, that's okay across the year. But what about per hour? And if we use power in the middle of the day, it might be 60% renewable and 40% coal and other stuff. Whereas if we use a lot of power at 6 p.m., that might be 95% coal and gas and only 5% renewable. So adjusting our ways of when we use power is becoming increasingly important. And firstly, to have to build storage to soak up daytime renewables to use for peak demand is going to be more expensive. The more we can just use electricity when solar and wind is directly available, the cheaper we'll be. And secondly, if we use more power in the middle of the day, that maintains a steadier wholesale price for wind and solar, and it encourages more subsequent investment in wind and solar. The price goes too low in the middle of the day each day, that discourages investment in new wind and solar farms.
Great, thanks for that. I see Daniel has got his hand up there. Did you want to take your, yep, great, and ask a question, Daniel?
I was wondering, when do you think we'll get a greater supply of EVs? Because my understanding is that a lot of the EVs get reserved for the EU, because the EU has like average grams per kilometer emission targets.
Yep.
So like Volkswagen and probably even Hyundai will send a lot of cars there.
Yep. Yeah, it's really true. I see all these state government rebates that have now come into play, sort of $3,000 EV rebate, but it's not really solving the right issue, I don't think, because I don't think there's a shortage of demand. There's a shortage of supply into Australia. Tesla have really caught up with their backlog of orders, and their wait time is more down to, say, 6 months. And it does sound like a long time, but that's quicker than trying to get a Toyota RAV4 or a Land Cruiser, which are 12-month wait times. So it is petrol car issue at the moment for supply, not just EVs. There's also like that Hyundai Ioniq I mentioned. They sell them in 150.
I'd love one if I could afford it.
Yeah, 150 at a time they sell, and it goes online every couple of months and it sells out in a minute. The first couple of times it was kind of cute and nice to see a headline. Now I feel like they're still doing it. It's like they're toying with us, like, yeah, it's next month, wait out, and you miss out again. So I think in the EU, they have, as you say, emissions standards, and it is compulsory that
they get fined if they don't meet them, right?
Yeah, or buy certificates from other EV suppliers, and
like
that even
Tesla.
Yeah, that even exists in California. So I don't think that will be politically palatable in Australia, because I just see that headline by the detractors saying, the government's going to make it more expensive for you to get your dual cab ute. And I think that'll last a day, that policy, with the Daily Telegraph and the Herald Sun. They'll shoot it down. So I'm not sure any sort of certificates or trading systems. So to get more supply in Australia, I think the best policy would be for the federal government just to start doing bulk orders, like, hey, can we get 10,000 Ioniqs, or, try and get new models into the market and options, and kind of underwrite it. Say, yeah, we'll buy 10,000, you sell them to local customers, and if you've got 3,000 left over, we'll take them, or if you're selling them at a discount, we'll cover the gap, just to try and get these new models and suppliers get the, a bit of economy of scale, 10,000, so they get a foothold in the market. It's very expensive for Ford and Toyota to bring in new models and train up all the service mechanics and salespeople about how EVs work and so on. So they either come in a big batch, or they just don't bother releasing any models at all because it's expensive servicing just a low volume of a new model.
But they still need to be confident that they're going to meet their EU obligations before they send us any as well.
Oh, so yeah, there probably is a global supply. You can see on my second Tesla that arrived in a month. So if we did EV incentives like 3 or 4 years ago, we'd be sailing by now. Unfortunately, they've all come in while there's a global supply crunch, and that's, lots of global issues going on, chip shortages, Ukraine war, COVID absenteeism, freight issues and everything.
Do we miss out on some because they don't get converted to right-hand drive as well?
Possibly, yeah. I think right-hand drive is like 40% of the global market. So we're not alone in that regard. I think Japan's right-hand.
They are, yeah. They're right-hand drive. Cool, thanks.
Great. Do we have any more questions? We've got about 5 minutes still to go. No, it looks like we've pretty much exhausted all the questions. Just let me make sure that I haven't missed anything critical in the chat. I don't think I have.
Well, I guess while you do that, Seb, there was a company at the boot camp yesterday, Virion, I think they were called, like they're an asset management service provider, and they haven't done any renewables or EVs, but they recently bought a hydrogen car in Melbourne. And I thought, well, that's kind of interesting, but it feels like they're still treating sustainability as something that's far off in the future. And I guess my message today would be that, wind and solar, it's mainstream now, and electric vehicles also. It's not something that's far off in the future. It's actually here today. Pricing is competitive with petrol cars, and we do want to get the sticker price lower. But if the resale is so high, the cost of ownership is actually quite low. So it's here and now, and the time is now, I would say.
Yeah, look, thank you so much for that. And I think one of the things that I certainly got out of your talk today was, yes, there can be exciting as a personal or individual consumer to own one, but then even if you don't own an EV yourself and it's not on the current horizon for whatever reason, for those of us who work for large organizations, be they universities or many other large organizations, thinking about the infrastructure, how we accommodate and provide the infrastructure for staff, in our case students as well, means that it has to be on our radar, even if we're not thinking about necessarily owning one in the near term ourselves, despite your advocacy, Jonathan. So look, thank you so much for today. It's been really valuable, and thank you everyone for tuning in.